Hi, this is Paul. One of the huge blessings of having a YouTube channel and all of you out there that watch things is that when things appear on the internet that would be of interest to me, you send them to me. And while I can't watch everything everyone sends to me, when I get a whole bunch of you yammering at me about a certain video, well, I have to pay attention to it, and it goes up to the top of my to watch hierarchy, and that's what happened with Rebel Wisdom's interview with Ken Wilber. I hadn't heard much about Ken Wilber. I have seen a number of videos on the integral movement. I didn't really know much about it until this last year with Jordan Peterson stuff, and these two movements tend to intersect. I've watched some videos about it. I'm by no means an expert on it. I haven't actually read a book about them. But like I said, I've seen a few videos, and with all of you writing me and saying, watch this video, comment on this video, watch this video, I thought, well, maybe I should take it on. So first, some appreciative comments about what I've learned from it, both this video and other videos. I thought this video was particularly helpful for me to try to get a sense of what this is about. I see it establishing a nomenclature, a system of vocabulary for structuring some of the conversations we're having today about the nexus of social change, philosophy, religion, morality. It's there's a whole network there's a whole nomenclature that pulls this all together. Will this nomenclature continue to catch on with the colors and the spiral and the quadrants? I don't know. We'll see. Obviously, a key element of integral is integration, integrating things from the past as development moves in successive levels towards the future. And it's an attempt to sift, to integrate, to appreciate without too quickly judging and dismissing. Although in the process of sifting and integrating, you're, in a sense, choosing the good, choosing the winners, and the old gets subsumed in the new, and there's a sense of progress that moves forward. I'm going to talk more about the progress thing. But so here you have the colors, and you have the animist tribe, the power tribe, the ethnocentric amber, the modern orange, the postmodern green, and then eventually the second level teal that comes. And again, I think there's use in this nomenclature, and the colors make nice shorthand. And I appreciate the spiral image where it's both progressive and circular. That's just a very clever thing. And so this is stuff that I think is helpful. And then there's the quadrants, the interior, the subjective inner world, and the cultural intersubjective, the exterior objective scientific, and the social systems interobjective. So I thought the quadrants, this was a very helpful way of mapping things and delimiting things. A little bit of critique. I often find the progressivism just a little too convenient. The British imagined themselves to be the great conclusion to a long history of thought and progress and religious development, and the Germans did too, and all religions do too. I mean, Christianity, Islam, Church of Latter-day Saints, many religions imagine themselves as we are the pinnacle of what we've been doing, and part of that is just the effect of being a human being and looking back, because you look back over the path that your particular tribe has moved through, and you say, here we are, the culmination. Well, you can't help but be the culmination. And then we usually, from our point of view, draw a trajectory line into the future that sort of maps our desires and our goals. I find that there has to always be an implied telos in this, or a goal. And usually the descriptions of the culmination feel a little too much of the now and our dreams for now. That's just my sense of it, and so I'm really unsure about the value judgments, especially when all of this is in many ways within a secular framework. Now again, they are trying to integrate secularity and traditional religion, and in many ways I think a lot of the insights I heard from Ken Wilber in this video were helpful, and I learned things from it. but I do find that the overall approach tends to secularize religion. And I think because, I think what I tend to feel in that is that there's unlike, let's say, a traditional religion like the Bible, the Bible establishes the telos, which is outside of time. It's above secular space. And whereas with this, I tend to think that we're navigating from the inside, trying to line up points together. And so we're lining up points within the iron box of secularism and drawing the line between them and say, okay, this is how it's going to go. The difficulty that you always have is that there are so many points that the points you select in terms of choosing your trajectory, that can tend to become a little arbitrary or self-serving, whereas at least theoretically, with the idea of revelation, perhaps you have a point which is privileged and outside the box of secularity, although it always has to be brought into the language within this sphere that we can wrestle with. And so whenever I watch the integral stuff, that's always lurking in the back of my mind, thinking, this is a little too convenient and also a little weird. And I don't mean weird just in the conventional sense. It's the acronym for Western, egalitarian, industrialized, rich, and democratic. This feels very much of our culture and our culture now. And so 3 years from now, I think it will continue to feel very much of our culture and our culture now. Whereas the power of a system within the secular frame tends to be in its predictive capacity. That's how, within this box of what we can see, that's how we tend to evaluate people and movements. Because if you notice this in politics, if someone has managed, let's say, to predict who's going to win the presidential election, we listen to them next time because they were right once, and will they be right again? And when we look back over time, we look at those authors and thinkers who predicted, for example, if you listen to Jordan Peterson, he makes a big deal of Nietzsche predicting a lot of the 20th century. That gives Nietzsche credibility, and it gives credibility to a number of his other ideas. The difficulty that we have when we're doing the kind of thing that I sense this movement does is that there's always the temptation to fudge it at the end. And, oh yeah, well, I might not have said that 10 years ago, but that certainly was on my mind. And that's just natural human behavior. But I tend to suspect that thinkers from other cultures would likely have very different ideas of exactly where the spiral is leading to, if in fact they envision it as a spiral at all. So in that sense, the thought tends to seem fairly bounded by our Western weird culture. I may be wrong. Like I said, I don't know a lot about the movement, but that's sort of what I suspect. I don't think you're going to see. Some Westerners might call some certain African thinkers integral, but I don't know that a lot of Africans are embracing this, partly because, again, this feels very much that it's part of our culture and a little bit bound by it. So there's a couple of critique comments. Within the video, there was a fair amount of, as typical of a lot of Rebel Wisdom stuff, they kind of, like me, made their name in the updraft of Jordan Peterson. David was early on with an excellent document of Jordan Peterson, excellent documentary. Much of Ken Wilber's Jordan Peterson critique I really agreed with, and I very much enjoyed that segment of the video. And it just, Wilber would say something and I'd say yes, and he'd say something else, I'd say yes. And so I was very much tracking with Ken Wilber on so much of his critique of Jordan Peterson. Had very many ideas and points similar to my own. I appreciate Wilber's obvious breadth and mastery of a range of materials across discipline. Again, this is an integral process, so they're trying to integrate all of this siloed knowledge. You've got knowledge from philosophy and knowledge from psychology and knowledge from religion and knowledge from other sciences and knowledge in politics, and you want to try and pull them together. And he's dropping names that it's like I've never even heard of some of these people. So that part of that comes with age and experience and having done this for a while. But the guy is clearly very smart, very well read, very well spoken, very articulate. Pleasure to listen to. So very much enjoyed listening to him kind of processing Jordan Peterson. And I appreciated him working through the history, showing how technology shapes worldview. Again, I got my undergrad degree in history, and so I'm a history lover. And I thought he was enjoyable to listen to. But through most of the video, I kept wondering, well, why are people so interested in me hearing this video? Many people before have sent in links to integral type videos, and I've watched a number of them, and my impression of them was pretty much what it is here. But then in the last segment of the video, in the last 20 minutes, he got into a whole bunch of stuff that I thought, oh, now I know why everyone's saying I should listen to this. And again, I thought a lot of his critiques and points were, he really upped, when he got into this section, he really upped my appreciation for the entire integral project. And we're all limited by what we've had time in our life to study and the circumstances that our lives had afford us to study and to think and to know and so on and so forth. So when he's dealing with areas that I don't have much expertise in, it's hard for me to evaluate because I haven't read some of the authors he's talking about and I haven't processed some of that material. So I'm listening, thinking. So I use my general critique and I listen to the new things he's saying through the general critique, and that's just kind of the process that we use to listen. But then when he got into some of this area towards the end of it, well, now he's getting into some stuff that I have a little bit more background in, and so now I can, I think, give him a little bit fairer critique, and for the most part I found myself agreeing with a lot of what he was saying here. So I thought I would play some of this and do a little bit of commentary on it, and we'll see where it goes.
So
there's a theological point. Like a lot of people are critical.
Now I also noticed that David, many times he's used theological is an adjective that I hear David using more and more often, which is very interesting. I think, again, this is something that Jordan Peterson is bringing back into the culture. Peterson, well, in his talk with over at Cambridge, no, I don't want to restart now. That was the computer. I wonder if that comes in the video. We'll have to see. In Peterson's talk that he did at Cambridge recently, Peterson obviously is working on the theology, and in a tweet to Peterson's tweeting out a post on eternity that I played at the end of my last video, a little bit that I had read, eternity website in Australia. Peterson, I think Maps of Meaning really helped work on the verbs. And this, if he's going to make progress in integrating religion and improving his grasp on religion and how that integrates into the verbs that he has, making whole sentences, the next few years are going to be working on nouns, what is, ontology. And we'll see, even though, again, the question and answer video that Peterson had in Australia, what I believe is kind of private and I don't want to talk about it, and I think, well, yeah, but at the same time, doing the kind of work you're doing out in public just continues to beg these questions. And if I, as a pastor, would say, well, I'm kind of keeping my beliefs to myself, people would look at me and kind of wonder, what's going on with me. So again, David is more and more integrating the theological into his work, which I find interesting and I think a very good thing. So
of Jordan.
So
There's a theological point. Like a lot of people are critical of Jordan Peterson because on some level he's doing a really important role of restoring the role of the father in some sense. But there is a sense that he's looking back to, like he's trying to restore Christian values and very masculine religious values. Could it be that actually we're seeing a theological shift? So the kind of theology that we're moving into is more of a balance between masculine and feminine. Because as you've said, that the role of men and women is changing. So actually what we don't necessarily need a restoration of the sort of God the Father. Maybe what we need is a different theological synthesis.
well, I think that's part of the difficulties that come, and they come in part because we leave out that developmental component. So we were talking a little bit earlier about just the sort of Janet Shaffett's view, which I find there's some genuine truth to that as part of a overall integral framework. But you can see how there were shifts from more matrifocal societies to more patrifocal societies, and then to societies that started to try to overcome those. And those newer stages of development, certainly industrialization and information, to the extent that those had an effect on our culture, and they did, they're not something you found in the Bible. They're not something you found in early civilization. Now, Jordan might say, yeah, but we had the seeds for all that there. And I go, right. But notice that still took a while to unfold, and many of those early stages didn't have that. And many of these existential or even transcendental important givens that were being embedded in religion, those also tended to unfold, even though we can find in the Judeo-Christian tradition this tendency that would eventually lead to individual rights, even if it wasn't that often expressed in a full extent in the original orientation. And particularly since most of the world's great religions did arise during periods like the Great Axial Period, roughly a millennia or so BCE. Those really were the era, Gene Gebser's era, of just the modern mythic era. And for a lot of the religions created at that time, there were, again, these two different aspects. There was a very small number that were involved in waking up, actually having.
Now, when we get to the end of the video, this waking up we're going to want to talk about, because again, this is where the telos tells, because you can't help but have something at the top of your hierarchy. You can't help but imagine that especially if you've got a progressive development, you progress towards something, and that which you have implicit out there tends to help you select the data points that you integrate into your spiral there. And so what's fair to ask people is, why is that privileged? That's a key question with any type of progressivist religion or ideology or political worldview.
This transformative small. There were, again, these two different aspects. There was a very small number that were involved in waking up, actually having this transformative satori experience of ultimate unity consciousness. But most of them were just, okay, what do I have to do to stay on the good side of this God? What do I have to do here? Or here's a history of my people, or something like that. When it's
okay, so you heard right there the comparison between, let's say, the mystical experience of at one-ment, the experience where the ego, the self, the fixed consciousness passes away versus following the rules, following the laws in order to please the God and earn yourself entrance into whatever the next stage is. Now he's just passing reference to these, but I just want to note that separation and also note the hierarchy that he has placed them in. Now, ideally, they're going to want to be integrated. And that is something that in many of our contemporary conversations, they're not. In other words, it's an A or B. Either if you are someone who is, let's say, following rules, then you are someone who is kind of at a lower level, less mature. So in other words, some of this progress always has within it, no matter how much you try to integrate and how fair you'll be, there's always a less than and greater than. Now, he deals with this at one point. I don't remember if it's before or after this point. And he deals with this because that's a fundamental issue with hierarchies and equalities. And I mentioned the other video, and I should probably do a video at some point on this completely. The way that Christianity manages hierarchy and equality, because Christianity is always doing that, going back and forth. And I really learned that back when I was doing an in-depth study of the Gospel of Luke and then the book of 1 Peter. You find Jesus is always playing around. Jesus is always moving. What's the best word? Playing around with the status. He's always, that's always moving in Jesus, and it's changing. And so you have a greater than or less than. Well, how do you have a greater? How can you be a less than and still? How can you be a less than and still, in a sense, arrive and have that be the summum bonum, the sum of all goods? Another video that's ringing around in my head is a treatment of, what is, it's an eschatological treatment. So we've done a fair amount of epistemology early on, the Jordan Peterson belief in God. That gets into ontology, and with the resurrection of Jesus and the question of God, that gets into ontology. But at some point, we're going to really have to wrestle with eschatology, because it's in eschatology that these telos points that orient our narratives, especially progressive narratives, that's the end fixed point. And actually establishing that telos, that eschatology, is remarkably difficult. If you ask someone, what do they want? Well, I want to be happy. Okay, and as Jordan Peterson says, well, do a bunch of cocaine. Boom, the drug will send a rush. You'll be deliriously happy for a very short time, and then you burn out your receptors and you'll never be that happy again. Sorry. Well, maybe you should just do a massive amount of cocaine and die of an overdose. Maybe that, in fact, is the good life. Is the good life one of struggle and achievement, meaning carrying your cross up the hill? Is the good life of arriving at a blissful state, heaven as it were? Is that the good life? And once you put that in the focus, it is actually remarkably difficult to figure out, well, what really is the good life? And that's why eschatology and the summum bonum, however you describe that, is one of those fixed points of my answer to, well, what is a religion? Religion asks certain basic questions about the meaning of life. Religions answers those. And eschatology is always one of those fundamental elements.
Says most of them were just, okay, what do I have to do to stay on the good side of this? For a very small number, they were involved in waking up, actually having this transformative satori experience of ultimate unity consciousness. But most of them were just, okay, what do I have to do to stay on the good side of this God? What do I have to do here? Or here's a history of my people, or something like that.
Now, again, before he goes further, I did want to mention, I probably ticked him off when I did this, but Benjamin Boyce had done this a video I really loved, where he's driving in the car and he's talking about, he's just kind of open mouth on spirituality and religiosity and all of this, and this prioritization of the mystical over the, let's say, dutiful, banal, common rule keeping is something very deeply, it's something very much assumed right now in our culture. And the problem I have with that is similar to the problem that C.S. Lewis notes with respect to Hinduism versus Christianity. That C.S. Lewis makes the point that real things scale. And so what we want our integral systems to do is actually to integrate that lower system with the upper system so that it's one thing. And actually, in terms of two-speed and one-speed Protestant Reformation issues, that's a Charles Taylor observation, and I know that there are limits to the observation, and Protestantism isn't just one speed by any means, and Catholicism isn't just two speed. But the vision of, let's say, Calvin's Geneva was to create that city on a hill, and for that city on a hill to be completely integrated, you had the church and the workplace, and every day you're going to work, you're also worshiping, and your labor in the garden is as much worship as your time in the pew. And so part of what was important for Calvin's Geneva and the Protestant vision was an integration of this. Now, I'm not saying that integration wasn't in medieval Roman Catholicism, but it tended to be more of a two-speed, two-stage system. You had nature and grace. And you had, for example, in Dante's Paradise, you had the beatific vision of Beatrice. The difficulty that we have is that we don't want to choose between these, but it's important to see the distinctions between them as well. And so all of this, so the holy grail of integral remains outstanding with all of these different visions, because as he rightly says, there's goodness in many, 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 many things. And at least theologically, what I believe happens in the eschaton, and you see it in Isaiah chapter 60, is God harvests all the goodness of the world and properly brings that into the life of the age to come. Now, in order to do that, there's going to be hierarchies. But C.S. Lewis had a lovely essay that he wrote on equality, where you talk about the specific joy of the, I'll say it this way, he didn't say it this way, the specific joy of the underclass. And that sounds so heinous to our American ears, but he says the dog's joy before his master, the son's joy before his father. There's a specific joy of being beneath and submitting fully that runs against our American imagination. We are so ambitious. If we're not at the top and have no rivals, or if anyone is above us, we assume that is not as good a state. And C.S. Lewis says, no, well now, okay, look at the two cultures. You've got very egalitarian American culture, and you've got stratified older English class systems. So, but then you would have to say, well, perhaps Lewis has a view into the goodness of that system that we don't really have from our American cultural perspective, because it's simply the blind side and the bias of our culture. So I'm going to have to back it up and play what I did before. So yeah, a little more repetition.
When a small number that were involved in waking up, actually having this transformative satori experience of ultimate unity consciousness. But most of them were just, okay, what do I have to do to stay on the good side of this God? What do I have to do here? Or here's a history of my people, or something like that. When it says Moses parted the Red Sea, when that was first written, when the person sat down and wrote Moses parted the Red Sea, they didn't have some deep symbolic meaning to that. It didn't mean, oh, the Israelites had to overcome a lot of problems, and we looked to our leader Moses, and he could help do away with blockades like moving a Red Sea, and that was all symbolic. And then we moved out and found our own promised land. That's not what the person meant when they wrote Moses parted the Red Sea. They meant this guy named Moses stood next to the Red Sea, and he went whack, and the sea parted, and they walked across. That's what he meant.
Now, when he said this, I got hooked. And because this is the limitation of the symbolic. And again, with polysemy, with the multi-layered reading, historically in the late Roman period and the medieval period. I mean, you can find this in Augustine and in other church fathers. Again, this is now this is what Ken Wilber is bringing to the conversation, and the post-modernist fundamentalist war American evangelicals listen to this and say, yes, that's right. It's the plain reading of the text. And I think Ken Wilber is right to push back on this, because Peterson hasn't done Exodus yet, but he in many times has tipped his hand when he talk about, well, where did Moses get the law? And you almost have the sense that this is something that is written to symbolically encode certain ideas instead of the Moses part of the Red Sea. Now, there's actually a lot going on in terms of, is it the Red Sea? Is it the Reed Sea? What exactly was the path? Was there a historical exodus? I mean, that is a huge conversation in, now you see, if I say critical theory, you're going to hear it in another way. That is a huge conversation in biblical criticism, biblical historical criticism. And that opens up this entire fundamentalist modernist fight. And Peterson, in his psychological reading, has wanted to sidestep this. But Ken Wilber's critique here is very fair, because to assert that the text arose out of some sort of dream state, that someone, it's almost as if someone was writing fiction, and at some point people later on didn't recognize that they were writing fiction and took it as history, and that then is the source of all our problems. And you will hear that said by people often. Now, Ken Wilber kind of brings in what's sometimes been called the plain sense of the text, that the Red Sea parted. And so I agree with Ken Wilber on this, that part of what happens if you get too symbolic, and this is part of what the Protestant Reformation pushed off against. And you can sense that if I've mentioned these commentaries before, you get a sense sometimes that things are getting a little too disconnected from the text, and now we're right in the middle of still this modernist battle for the Bible, and postmodernity isn't helping. And again, this is why going through the Jordan Peterson thing for me has, as if anything, strengthened my conviction in the importance of the historical resurrection of Jesus Christ, because it has reinforced in my mind the need for redemption to not be simply metaphorical or escapist, even in, let's say, a mystical vision attempt. And that's why at some point I'm going to have to wrestle in my videos with this question of the summum bonum, of the greatest good, of what we were made for. And I think the Bible, in fact, tells us this and gives us this. But what many Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox, the crunchy Christians, let's call them, who continue to assert the physicality of Jesus' resurrection and the historicity of biblical events within. See, the problem is that swings way out to a degree that didn't seem to be supportive by ancient people's understanding of what they were doing when they were recording. And I think Ken Wilber is right here by sort of grounding it and saying, this text attempts to relate history, and it isn't all just a dream or a vision. Now, there are dreams and visions in it, and the question of, well, where do these laws come from? How are these laws formed? Did God dictate, did God give the law to Israel or not? And if we can't, this is so hard in our cultural moment, because you're going to get whacked from one direction or the other if you say, and that's why I'm very comfortable with the way my denomination framed it in the 70s, when a lot of these issues were coming to a head in terms of event character. And oh boy, this stuff is so hard to talk about, because you're just going to get whacked from one side or another. And so my consciousness Congress is heating up, and it's looking more like the British Parliament than the American House of Representatives right now, because they're yelling back and forth at each other. But Ken Wilber, I think, whereas Peterson might have a tendency to drift off into mere mythology and symbolism, Ken Wilber, I think, is rightly saying, now wait a minute, let's not float off in the hot air balloon of mythology and symbolism. There needs to be a tether here. And many of you will say, well, why does there need to be a tether there? Well, because, again, of this question of the summum bonum, the end state, the life of the age to come. In secularism, one way that we can produce harmony between people, remember, polytheism is a way to produce harmony between conflicting religious traditions. Secularism is another way to produce harmony between conflicting religious traditions, with usual continued deference to pluralism and cutting things off from history, turn everything into mythology. And in some of the later N.T. Wright Gifford lectures, when N.T. Wright gets into some of this, I probably want to make some videos, and I might use some of the Gifford lectures for that. So there's a lot going on here. And so once again, Ken Wilber's budding Jordan Peterson on some of these points. Amen. Amen.
And so again, when James Fowler was actually measuring these developmental stages of religious belief systems.
And then he loses, well, that doesn't lose me again, but Fowler's levels of, remember Peterson so it was the Rebel Wisdom video, Rebel Wisdom interview, when at the end of it he calls me out for not listening enough. He talks about he doesn't like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I think something the same about Fowler's hierarchy of religious development. It's a little too convenient. It's prioritizing some things that I don't think, I think it's too convenient. It bears some of the issues that I have with this integral style of thinking.
And again, like most developmental models, he found 6 to 8 major stages of development, and they were versions of archaic to magic to mythic, rational, pluralistic, and integral. Most of these were what he actually called mythic literal, because the myths were meant literally. And so you'll notice when Peterson tells us the meaning.
Don't you just want to know what he's trying to remember with the thing on his finger? Why every time he moves that hand, one guy in my consciousness Contra says, the string on the finger, ask him, but he can't answer.
Of Genesis, or the meaning of Exodus, or those kinds of things. He doesn't agree with the literal meaning. And the literal meaning is what the original writers meant. That's what they were saying.
Not just the original writers, but many successive generations, and assumed that they didn't, and see, this is part of part of the problem that happened in the modernist fundamentalist fight was that they swung way too far. One group swung way too far over on the literal, and the other group swung way too far over on the mythological. You've got Boltman's mythology, which again in a previous video I think it's very different from Peterson's, but I think actually you want to integrate these two views. And the church fathers did that, and the medieval church did that. And this is something that, well, see, if you read John Calvin does this kind of thing a lot too. But the further we got into the modernist period, the more people came to us and said, you must choose, you can't have both. And I'm not going to pick. I'm not going to make Sophie's choice here. And you can't make me.
But he's trying to read something deeper into that. And that might be there. And to some extent, of course it is, simply because societies have not only their explicit conscious understandings, but all sorts of infrastructure interactions and mechanical systems that occur that we know nothing about or don't really understand. So all of that's fine. And we do have those whole left-hand, first and second person implicit rules and patterns of behavior that we're really not that much aware of. So it's okay for him looking for those. But one of the reasons that he won't himself just say, yeah, I believe that, he doesn't believe Moses really parted the Red Sea.
Well, and see, I'd probably say he's preferring to be agnostic about whether Moses parted the Red Sea, because I don't think Peterson has weighed in on this, and he hasn't done in the biblical series on Exodus. But and I think, when Peterson makes the point, I don't want, when Peterson doesn't want us to get derailed on this point, because so many times, if you go here with the Bible, you will get derailed and you will not be able to appreciate the payout of the story. So, and this is the point that I was making in some of the conversations that I will be putting out over the next while. I'm just trying to store up conversation so that when I'm off in Australia, the channel won't be totally abandoned. But this for us is a really hard thing to integrate and think through. And I think the reason has been because of, and I think Ken Wilber is pointing to this, because of some of the choices that were made in the modernist period. What's that, Amber? So, and his first person, second person, third person language, I think, when he uses that stuff, that's really good. I'm gonna steal that. I'm gonna use that. So, Ken Wilber, he's doing some colonizing in my consciousness Congress, but there's good stuff here. There's good stuff here.
Not literally. So that's not what he's talking about. And this is a little bit where the problem comes in. Because if you're going to do that, and you're going to look for these underlying rules and patterns, it really best evidence is that those unfold, those develop, those have changed. We don't look at human sacrifice the way we did.
And I want to go back and listen to that again, because he's got a point. I'm not sure how I feel about it.
Those and patterns, it really best evidence is that those unfold, those develop, those have changed. We don't look at human sacrifice.
And we'll get to sacrifice in a minute, but that's right. And a lot of biblical historical criticism has paid a lot of attention to that. And as with almost every project, there's always the initial temptation, which is pretty much inevitable, to overreach. And so even when they were finding in literature, the literary criticism, Robert Alter being the king of that, there's these literary structures. They found structures everywhere, and later on they had to walk back some of the structures. So there's almost always initial overreach, but after it has matured, you begin to appreciate, okay, there's that layer, and there's that there too, and so there's the historical layer, or the plain sense layer, and that's there, and it might not be as simplistic as we would demand, but, and I think Peterson has been very helpful with this, even if I am going to describe something that happened 10 minutes ago in this room, that is not a simple thing. That the room and the event have far more aspects to that than I can channel through both my tiny little consciousness and then out even through this tiny little stream of words that has to go through time, or that has to be put on paper. There's selection in every layer of this, and if like me, you are a more conservative Christian and you embrace a belief that God inspires the Bible, that's not God dictates the Bible. I don't believe in mechanical inspiration. I believe in organic inspiration. That this is all part of this process, and there's selection and limitation and all of that in there. So if you imagine a robust theology of inspiration, authorial intent is certainly an anchor you need to have, but the New Testament affords more too, that there are other layers which are legitimate. There are other levels of interpretation which are also legitimate within the overall project. Okay? I don't know if that makes any sense, or if this is too much wonky biblical interpretive language.
The way we did 4,000 years ago. Those developed, those have changed. We don't look at human sacrifice the way we did 4,000 years ago. There are different implicit rules for that. We did do that at archaic to magic periods, but then we grew out of those, and there are different grammars, different rules at each of these stages. And the same goes for how men and women have interacted. Even if we agree with, let's say, a big five statistical analysis that men have more industriousness and women have more agreeableness and negative emotions, say, okay, that's fine. But just as we saw with the Janet Schaff's analysis of the male and female roles at different techno-economic eras, even though it's the same biology, there can be these differences in terms of what's masculine and what's feminine. And so if we want to...
A key part, obviously, when you're looking at the idea of integral, even though, to use hands, even though my hands are integrated, fingers and hands are still distinct. And that's a really key and helpful aspect of this thought, that men and women are together in a project, they're still distinct. The layers of meaning in a biblical passage, they're still distinct, but they're interlocked and working together. And so the freedom that this finger has just kind of out here in and of itself, well, it loses some freedom here, but its position here is important.
Choose some of those things that have some sort of truth today, and then we're going to track them all the way back, 2,000-3,000 years ago. We have to be very careful about how we do that. And one of the things that I think will help Peterson's explanation of religion is if he does look at these different stages of religion, the actual beliefs as they unfolded, and not simply sort of put them all together as a single narrative and then try to read the existential underlying rules for all of them.
And I think Wilber is dead on right here. And that's where a conversation with someone like N.T. Wright, or part of the reason, I think many of you know this, part of the reason often more conservative biblical scholars are helpful, and that's why often with my commentaries, I try to default to more conservative scholars, not always, but and I don't do it just because I'm trying to preserve my theological purity or identity. It's because I have found that the more conservative, relatively conservative, there are people that go too far and they get useless going the other way, but they will tend to engage on multiple layers. They're not going to give up the historical layer. They're not going to too quickly and too easily dismiss. And I think what Wilber is right is that actually allows for better history. That, okay, this layer, they believe that. Take that seriously. Don't just say, oh, they believe that because they were ancient mythological people and they didn't have science. I mean, that's like kind of this Sam Harris dismissal. If you do that, you lose something. Take those people seriously. This is C.S. Lewis's admonition against chronological snobbery. Take the people seriously. Even if someone had lesser technology, they had other information you don't have. And this is one of Jordan Peterson's rule. Listen to ancient people as if they have something to tell you. And I think Peterson often practices that. But in this admonition, I think Wilber is right that paying attention to the layers of belief is really helpful in helping us understand the text today. Following the path certainly helps us understand the trajectory and the ways that our interpretations are formed. And this is why biblical commentaries that deal in history of interpretation I find tremendously interesting, because we all have these cultural filters, and I would assume that these cultural filters are a negative bias that prejudices us against other ways of viewing the text. Again, if we go to John Vervaeke, his psychotechnologies, reading how other cultures, both contemporary cultures, Africans, Asians, liberal, conservative, diversity is helpful in seeing a text because it affords insight into other patterns, and that insight theoretically should offer us things that simply reading within our bubble won't. And so Wilber and his kind of stratified, integral, progressive approach affords a respecting of the layers that is extremely important. And I think Wilber is right. If you don't do that, your mythology can tend to just float off like an untethered weather balloon.
That's stages of religion, the actual beliefs as they unfolded, and not simply sort of put them all together as a single narrative and then try to read the existential underlying rules for all of them. Because that's a little bit dicey if you really are looking at different ways that human beings develop through their spiritual understanding. And again, I'll just mention James Fowler very quickly. He was one of the pioneers that was...
Yeah, and I think I think Fowler had all the same problems in that, oh, look, I'm at the pinnacle. You're going to have to show me, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor at yourself. Jesus puts that in many ways at the pinnacle. And is it necessarily more holy? And I think a lot of religious traditions critique this and deal with this tension. And I'm not saying Ken Wilber is going here, by the way. I don't know enough about him. But what Fowler's hierarchy tended to yield for me is that the monk in the monastery is finally achieving the end, the goal of all of this. But the farmer in the field who is feeding the monk, less so. Now, is this my American egalitarianism speaking? Maybe. But so how do I check it? Now, I'm a Protestant, so I check it against the Bible. And love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. If you're a scholar, See, I want to be less Greek, because a Greek would say, well, a scholar would be dealing with mental ideas and therefore is closer to the forms and is therefore higher than the guy working in the field. I would tend to say no. I would tend to say there is differentiation. The scholar loves God with his mind, and the someone who works with their hands loves God with their hands. And part of this is the Genesis story, where we see the Creator God as not just someone in Genesis 1 who speaks order into chaos, but in Genesis 2 who is someone who gets his hands dirty, who is someone who is of the soil. In other words, lo, he abhors not the virgin's womb. That materiality is not second order to thought. That is the Gnostic tendency that Christianity constantly deals with, and so whereas I very much do believe in hierarchies, we have to be careful with them lest some of these biases slip in, and I don't think these biases are warranted by the Bible. Okay?
If you really are looking at different ways that human beings develop through their spiritual understanding. And again, I'll just mention James Fowler very quickly. He was one of the pioneers that was looking at these different capacities that humans have. In this case, he looked at something that we would call spiritual intelligence. So like cognitive intelligence, emotional intelligence, moral intelligence, there's a spiritual intelligence. That's different from direct spiritual experience. Direct spiritual experience, that's waking up again. And we can talk a little bit about that because Peterson is perfectly aware of waking up. He's absolutely aware of it. But he doesn't really talk about that.
See, and also, okay, maybe my Protestantism is showing, but there is a sense that metaphor of waking up, and it is a metaphor. There's very much a sense of that in Christian conversion, but again, I think there's stuff built into that metaphor that I won't necessarily go along with. Not that I want people to be asleep. No, Jesus admonishes to be people awake and alert. But even in Jesus' handling of it, it's very physical. And that's one of the key ways that, obviously there was deep influence from Plato and Aristotle in Christianity, but the Bible always keeps it tethered in real life, in materiality, in flesh and blood, and doesn't just have it go off into the ether. And again, I'm not saying Ken Wilber is doing that, but these are the tendencies, and these are what some of my Consciousness Congress comes up with as I listen to this.
So he talks about more the growing up components and how that happened, but he doesn't take a look at some of these different stages, like Gebser's archaic, magic, mythic, into rational with the Western culture, and then into the multicultural, pluralistic postmodernism. Fowler found that, and he defined God the way Tillich did, as concern, or as an ultimate concern. So whatever your ultimate concern is, if you make a list of the most important things in your life, whatever the top of that list is your ultimate important thing. That's your God.
All right, that's your God. It might not be the God, but that's your God. I'm not critiquing Ken Wilber here, because that observation I agree with, that the most important thing in your life, that's your God. And idolatry is putting second things first.
Whatever it is. It could be atheism, and you're still using spiritual intelligence, because whenever you think about ultimate realities, that's what you're engaged in. That's the intelligence that you activate when you think like that. And Fowler found that it really did go through these very distinct, identifiable stages. And then if you combine that with people that have done historical work like Gene Gebser, you see some real similarities in those things. And they are profoundly different. I mean, you really can have a spiritual worldview that's magic. Voodoo tends to be an example of magic. Magic is the idea, and it tends to occur in developmental sequences fairly early because the human organism is learning to differentiate itself from the environment. And in the process where it's learning to do that, it hasn't quite succeeded. And so its mental image of a thing isn't really well differentiated from the thing. So it thinks that to manipulate its mental idea of the thing is to actually magically change the thing. So
this part too really interested me, because obviously if you're somebody's in the comment section said, well, what is a sacrament? I gave a little one-line answer, but I'm going to have to do a video on sacrament. Sacrament is not thread-borne and fudging, but this question of sacrament is connected to the question of magic, and it's the relationship between that which is above and that which is below and how they move. Now, everyone in the ancient world, we can talk about astrology, almost everyone in the ancient world, the Jews a little bit off it, but almost everyone in the ancient world simply assumed that heaven moved earth. Okay, that's the primary assumption. Now, part of the inversion that happens in the secular age is that earth moves heaven because there really isn't heaven, and brain moves mind. Okay, that's the priority in the secular age. And in the ancient world and in theism, mind moves brain, mind colonizes flesh. And I think probably the easiest example of it is you, because mind colonizes hand. C.S. Lewis talks about that in Miracles. And so when you get into the question of magic, and I think this is really cool stuff that he's doing here in terms of, well, how do the historical developments line up with the individual developments, and getting stuck. And again, there's yeah buts all along the way, but there's also some real fruit there and there's some real insight there. So this is really interesting. So at some point, I'm going to have to deal with magic and sacraments because, hocus pocus comes from the Latin Mass, and the Protestant Reformation. Part of the emphasis of the Protestant Reformation was the belief on the part of many of the Protestant reformers that for not, at the boy, these questions get hard. But at the popular level, sacramentalism had become magic, and it was corrupt and corrupting. And that's why the indulgences became such a flashpoint, because they just couldn't buy it. It becomes a bad pun. They just couldn't agree that purchasing this indulgence, the church would, it just seemed like fraud. And that impulse of the Reformation, I think, in some ways, moves out all the way to Sam Harris. So this is important stuff. And so his section here on magic I found particularly interesting, which means take a deep breath. Alchemy then comes in there. Jung comes in there. So, these are all things on my list that I'm going to have to wrestle with, things that I'd never wrestled with before. And I know a bunch of Jungians have lost patience with me, so, well, that's okay. Because I'm a very selfish journeyman, and I'm going on this journey at my own speed for my own reasons. And I just invite you to come along, but it's probably more about me than it is about you, so sorry. But all of these issues come together, and that's part of the reason why that the Lord's Supper becomes, what does this mean? That becomes the flashpoint of the Reformation. And Jesus Christ is the individual in history for which more books have been written than anyone else. The second person is Martin Luther. The Reformation is that big a deal, especially in the West. But as colonialism brought it out to the whole world, it's a big, big deal. And if you go all the way to the center of it, there you have the sacraments. And so when I started studying Jordan Peterson, I didn't have any idea that I would wind up having to do a lot of pondering about sacraments, and that what this movement that Peterson is a part of is all about sacramentality, which is next to alchemy and magic and astrology, and again, the Jews who have this line, no astrology, no magic, but the manna and the law and the dietary regulations, these were all sacramental. And then Jesus comes and starts to continue to play with that and declares the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Sabbath is sacramental. And if you're following my Rough Draft for Sunday series, you know I'm doing that. And so Wilber is right there in this stuff. So it's like, dude, this is fun. This is cool.
If I make it differentiated from the thing, so it thinks that to manipulate its mental idea of the thing is to actually magically change the thing. So if I make a doll that represents you and I stick a pin in the doll, I've actually hurt you. That's magic.
Right, but now this is where it gets fun. If I'm with you and I have a picture of you and I rip up a picture of you in front of you, depending on the context, of course, that hurts you. What do you mean it hurts me? It didn't, you didn't do anything to my body. But what is you? Well, you are this story, and your story is connected with my story, and there's the intersubjective between us. And, well, if let's say it's the standard trope for the wife kicking the guy out of the house. The guy gets back to his house, and all his clothes are on the front yard. Well, they'll get wet, and you can think about the clothes, but that's not what has happened. And so the clothing being on the yard is, in a sense, sacramental of the dynamics that are going on at the story level. So there's lots here, and in a sense, what's so interesting is that we're back here.
And we all have magic, we all have superstition, but that tends to be one of the earliest stages of cognitive development, one of the earliest stages of spiritual intelligence, and so on. And it is magic. As it starts to move towards mythic, you get a stage that spiral dynamics, for example, calls power gods. Because you realize there's still magic, or you think there's still magic in the world, but you don't have it anymore. You keep trying, it really doesn't work, so you sort of give up. But others have it. So mommy, for example, could change the yucky spinach into candy if she wanted, because she's a power god. And so,
great illustration.
If you want to be on the good side of your power god, you have to know how to be nice to it. You have to know what it wants to say, and develop these whole rituals or types of prayers and so on. And eventually that magic retreats into just supernatural beings, Zeus or Apollo or Yahweh, God, that kind of thing. And then you get the magic stage. And that occurs on up until you get the emergence of rational, which adds a third person perspective, reflects.
See, and it's when he starts making these leaps and tying them together as he does in terms of a priority. See, I don't know that rational and magic, they're connected, but even the child seeing the little god mommy turning spinach into candy, there's rationality in there too. So yeah, words that fudge rational might be coming up soon.
On that and goes, no, those aren't really real. If I want something, I'm going to have to do it myself through scientific experiment and research. So you're seeing those kinds of development occur in religion. And what Peterson does is he won't himself profess belief in any of what those stages actually say. Like I say, he doesn't really believe that Moses actually parted the Red Sea. He doesn't really believe that Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt.
And the question here isn't necessarily, we want to we want to respect Jordan Peterson's privacy a bit. We should respect it, period, not a bit. But, okay. See, Peterson, this I think Ken Wilber's dead on right here. Peterson wants to say it doesn't matter. And I get that a lot in the comments. It doesn't matter. No, I think it does matter. And I think it matters a lot. And I think Wilber is right here. And it matters on different levels.
But that's what the people that had that belief, that's what they believed. Now, how much they are also being influenced by these hidden factors that he sees what was really happening, that's a little bit more open to debate. I think they are there, but I think you do see shifts as development undergoes, because they just aren't the same fundamental rules at those different kinds of viewpoints. And you have to take those into account. And so that's one of the concerns with that. Now, his argument with Sam Harris is, Harris focuses exactly on what they're saying. And that's what he says, and that's wrong. And so he'll actually criticize Moses really parting the Red Sea. And he'll say, that's just false. We don't need it. Get rid of it. And then Peterson is, and Sam is doing it because he's not an eliminative materialist, but he does still tend to kind of reduce everything to third person determined causality. And there's no room for freedom in that at all. And so he'll take all of those actual literal statements of religion leading up to science, and he'll say all of that is just flat out bloody wrong. It has no business being there. It was a stupid mistake we made from the beginning. It's still around. We've got to get rid of it. Nothing good. And he's all doing it from that third person deterministic scientific stance. And Peterson is always going to know, wait a minute. There are these interior, left-hand, subjective and intersubjective realities. And yeah, okay, it's not actually Moses parting the Red Sea, but it is these really existential means that help us develop value systems in the first place, including a value for third-person science. That you just don't get that out of midair. That comes from this implicit belief system that you can see in these religions. But this is where they really are at cross purposes, because they're not really arguing the same thing at all, and both of them are leaving out these developmental stages. So what Sam really doesn't like is magic and mythic views of ultimate concern. He doesn't like them in Islam. He doesn't like them in Christianity. He doesn't like them wherever he sees them. And at the time that they existed, it was, in a sense, the best we could do. But today, yes, you can do better in terms of the types of truth.
And now, again, he's back into some of this progressivism, and I'm a little more hesitant. I was really, really with you. Now I'm it's hard to know if we're better off. And that's my... Progressivism always imagines a certain sample of comparisons and a certain filter through which you put those samples. And so the progressivism itself says more about the selection, the samples, and the filter than I think it says about history. That's and now, I think there's definitely a sense of progress within Christianity. It's not that I am religiously opposed to progress, but these progressivisms, the 20th century was a battle of progressivisms, and some of them were really deadly. Nazism is racial progress. Marxism is class progress. And, I've listened to enough Peterson, and I'm convinced enough with Peterson that some of those bad ideas get deadly. Well, some of the stuff we're seeing in our culture right now that Ken Wilber, I think, rightly criticized early on and did so very effectively and well, are also elements of progressivism. So I'm not looking to banish progressivisms, but I'm a little gun shy of them.
That might be attempting to be disclosed there. You can do better in many cases using a type of scientific third-person approach. But there still are all these interiors, and they still have various rules and patterns that govern them, and you can't get those just through an objective view of science. And that's where Sam is always holding out.
Right. And I think he nicely says, well, here you have Sam. And Sam has said, it's only this, what he would say, objective view of science. And Peterson, well, he's off over here in Mythland. They've got to connect somehow. They've got to work together, or you're going to have problems. And I think Ken Wilber's dead on right. So, yeah.
Now, the last thing I want to say just very quickly is that both of them are fully aware of waking up. And neither of them include that in their argument.
And even though Sam Harris's podcast is about waking, that's in the title, and they're both supposedly big on psychedelics, and Wilber's exactly right. It doesn't get into their theology at all. They have no place for it, but I'm not sure I'm with Wilber on his place in it too. So it's a very live environment.
And it's weird because the actual super core of a spiritual system is the system of waking up.
See, that's his telos. That's his eschatology. That's his summum bonum. And as a Protestant who looks at the Bible, and I think the summum bonum is life of the age to come. It's the new heavens and the new earth, and it's incarnated in the resurrected body of Jesus. And the resurrected body of Jesus does not float out of the grave in a lotus position. He walks, he eats fish, he talks. There are a lot of questions we have about it, which we can't answer. But this waking, this high priority waking, that doesn't grab me. Maybe it's again, when I was a little kid, I'd listen to things and I'd get the impression that, well, do you want to go to heaven? Well, heaven is like a forever church service. I have a hard time in the hour I'm supposed to be in there. And maybe that's why I'm a preacher, because I very much want to go to church, but it's easier if I'm talking through half of it rather than sitting. That's not true. I do enjoy sitting and listening to a sermon and those odd chance I get to do it. But, I mean, that's what's going on.
It's not developing a series of beliefs that, okay, I believe Moses really did that. And yes, I believe Christ really was born from a biological virgin. And if I agree to everything it says in the Apostle Creed, which is a list of myths, and I believe everything it says in the Nicene Creed, another list of myths, and I sign on the bottom line, that's it, I'm a Christian. I'm saved forever in a mythic worldview and so on. That's not what ultimate spirituality is about.
And here again is part of his filter, and whereas I certainly would have a critique of what's been called within the church easy beliefism, and Jordan Peterson with his action has a real point. And again, in the New Testament, Judgment Day is always according to what you've done in the New Testament, which is very, very interesting, especially for a religion and a Protestantism where you're saved by grace through faith. Again, some of Wilber's hierarchies, I disagree.
Even the Christian mystics would do more like what St. Paul said. Let this consciousness be in you, which was in Christ Jesus, that we all may be one.
Right, but Jesus isn't, again, sitting and floating in some Zen state. We watch Jesus fully realized when he's in the synagogue healing the man with the withered hand, when he's being in the crowd and a woman comes and grabs his cloak. yes, Jesus goes off into the lonely mountain for prayer. But, there's a Tolkien reference. But, this is why this is fun.
That's a fairly good description of ultimate unity consciousness.
And that's his bias.
What, around the world, there are various, at least sub-branches of religion that know about this. And it's called enlightenment, awakening. Sanskrit, it's moksha, pure freedom. It's satori, it's the great liberation.
Yeah, liberation from what? And now take that concretism that you just wanted Jordan Peterson to do and pull down. And again, I'm not trying to dismiss the mystical. I'm just questioning whether it's always at the top of your hierarchy. Because, well, the Bible is my main interpretive filter. So that's not the image I get from the Bible. That isn't to say there isn't Christian mysticism. That is not to say that that's a glorious thing. It's not to say that that isn't an element of it. But I am saying that doesn't subsume all of the earthly carnality, physicality, nephesh ideas in the Bible. That the God of creation is the God of redemption, and redemption doesn't actually come at the expense of creation. That created goods are perfected, not transcended or subsumed. Okay? So, great video. Loved the end of it. Again, the Rebel Wisdom guys continue to put out really good stuff, and I so appreciate, they're not my filter. They're not this, Dutch Calvinist Jordan Peterson fan filter, but they're huge Jordan Peterson fans, so they're more the men's work. And so what they're offering me actually with all of their stuff is window into, and I'm very high in openness, so window into whole realms of contemporary spirituality, the likes of which I just see little trails in people, but gives me a window into it and introduces me to guys like Ken Wilber and others that they've had on the show as if it's one show, others that they've done pieces with. And again, I think, wow, Rebel Wisdom, you're doing an outstanding job. So keep it up. And as with many, the more you get into event creation, oh baby, do that, because you definitely be an upgrade to Pangburn, and the possibility of these events, Peterson showed it with the Peterson Sam Harris events, but Peterson's book tour has shown it. I think all of this is only helpful in a day when we as a species, we as Western culture, need to do a lot more talking and processing and thinking and working together to figure out how to make progress together. And again, I do that obviously explicitly as a Christian, but participating in this far larger conversation that involves atheists and Buddhists and spiritual but not religionists and all over the place. So again, great video. Thanks for doing it. Deeply appreciate your work.